Yes.
Hi, welcome back again. So Teck is still here with us. Right now, our focus will be about forest conservation in ASEAN with a focus in Malaysia. So Teck can you explain more about the forest conservation work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I'd be quite happy to talk about a few projects I've been involved in forest conservation locally. But before that, I'd say a few words about forests in ASEAN. Well, ASEAN is blessed to be covered by a tropical rainforest originally. About 10,000 years ago, it was actually quite extensive, and it was connected because the sea levels were lower, much lower. You could walk from KL to Kota Kinabalu, and so Malaysia and Indonesia and Cambodia and Thailand were literally connected by one big rainforest, which is all interconnected with the plants and animals in common, and it was almost entirely covered with greenery. And what has happened since then, it's about 10,000 years ago when the sea level rose, the forests were all disconnected. And now, over the last 100 years, with huge amount of development, there have been lots of roads and agriculture, which has reduced the forest by more than 50%. Now, we are still fortunate in that we do have a substantial amount of forest remaining. And of that forest that's remaining, it's one of the most rich in biodiversity in the world. Like lots of plants and lots of animals that are not found anywhere else. And the number of species is quite impressive in that you have thousands of species of trees and millions of species of animals as
And
well.
if I'm not mistaken, we are also the home to the oldest virgin forest in the world. Am I correct?
Well, this is actually a controversial thing, because the question of what is a virgin forest, what's a completely untouched forest, because people have been living in this region for tens of thousands of years. The people have had some kind of an impact on the forest. For example, Orang Asli would be cultivating fruit trees, making small clearings in the forest, planting things like tubers and sago crops. So people have had an influence on how the forest has developed. So it's hard to say that there's any area which is completely untouched by humans. But what we do have is we have a series of protected areas, the famous national parks like Taman Negara and Gunung Kinabalu, which are relatively pristine, meaning that they have most of the natural mix of species, including many amazing plants like orchids and Rafflesia, and many amazing animals such as orangutan, tigers, and leopards and elephants.
And elephants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, not many people realize, but we still have tigers and elephants in Peninsular Malaysia roaming around in the jungle.
Wow, that's awesome. Hopefully they are still there. So about your work in Malaysia or in the region of Southeast Asia, can you explain more about it?
All right, what I've been working in recently is looking at controlling deforestation and controlling illegal logging. And these issues stem quite closely to governance issues generally. So by governance, I mean how we manage the forest, how we look after our natural resources. And what is interesting about the whole of ASEAN is that originally it was just made up of small communities which were kind of loosely tied together into kingdoms. But when it came to forest management, the kingdoms didn't really have much interest or much say in what actually happened in the forest. It's only recently, when the nation states have come about in, say, the last 100 years, that the state has had a great interest in the forest by logging, because they've made, while politicians connected to the state have managed to exploit these natural resources the timber trees itself for export to around the world and they can make a lot of money by cutting down these valuable trees. And so what's happened is that the control over these forests has moved away from the local communities to the state. And the state has countered by coming back and saying, all right, we'll create these forest reserves, totally protected area, not allow people to go in unless they have a license. And that has had several implications into how the forests are managed. Because on one hand, it is kind of, it's a stronger way of protecting them. You put a fence around the forest. But on the other hand, it's not really sustainable in the long term.
Oh, why so?
Because the local community doesn't have a sense of buy-in, doesn't have a sense that, all right, this is my forest, I want to protect. And so later on, when the state comes in and say, okay, maybe we can clear the forest for, say, a highway or for oil palm plantation, then, the community doesn't have much to lose because they don't have a sense of ownership to begin with. So it's a dangerous model and it's an unsustainable model. And so the more sustainable model would be to go back to the original one where the control of the resources is in the hands of the local people.
So you are suggesting that the locals should work together with the government as maybe as rangers or as the stewards or the owners of the forest.
Yeah,
is that the case?
I would go even further. I would say that the government needs to recognize that in many cases the native customary rights of the local community include the rights of control over the forest. And the state should recognize these rights and empower the local communities to manage the resources themselves. And there are some interesting case studies where this is happening and has happened and is happening.
So I want to highlight certain things like that in terms of development and the state, especially in relation to illegal logging, how bad it is in Malaysia or in Southeast Asia.
Well, illegal logging has got two levels. One is you've got the stereotype where you've got a forest which is protected by law, and then you have people raiding the forest, maybe coming in with the bulldozer, cutting down trees and pulling out the logs completely illegally. And so in general, what has been happening in Indonesia and in other parts of ASEAN was that there was a period of transition, remember, over reformasi where there was decentralization in Indonesia. And during that transition, there was a spike in this kind of unauthorized forest clearance and felling. Unfortunately, that is increasingly becoming under control. And in Malaysia, we have also had very little of that kind of illegal logging. But the issue in many states is that the law in terms of forest resource management isn't that clearly defined. And so logging maybe is given a license by the state, but there are many questions about the legality in terms of, one, how the license was given, and two, even after the license is given, whether or not the license gives the state the right to completely log an area or clear an area, especially when you've got local people saying that, hey, this is actually our land, you have no right to give a license to log it.
Yeah, that's true. So talking about forest conservation we widen the scale to ASEAN right now. You mentioned that there's a working group called ASEAN Senior Official Forests. So what do they do?
Well, this is quite an interesting example of ASEAN cooperation in the sense that the forestry officials from all different ASEAN nations, they come together regularly and they agree on some kinds of ways to work together. And one thing that they have done is they've come up with a scheme which has been working towards creating a common set of standards on how forests should be managed. And this is the idea of standards of forest management is quite interesting because it was created about 20 years ago in response to a backlash of the West saying, oh, we want to save the rainforest, so therefore we should boycott tropical timber. We should not buy any timber that has come from the rainforest. So, for example, when they went out and they want to buy a new table or buy a new chair, they
would rather buy it from other sources.
Yeah. And they would check, they might ask, oh, does this contain any tropical timber? If not, it's okay, but if it does, then they say they don't want to buy it.
Isn't it sad, like, the reason why we have, in Southeast Asia, we have this committee is because of, other countries who comply with international standards. But we ourselves we should have set our own benchmark on what kind of standard that we want to achieve for ourselves, isn't it?
Well, this is exactly what they're doing, and it's good that the ASEAN is setting its own standard, or Malaysia is setting our own standard. And so the positive story that came out of this boycott is that Western environmentalists, they realize that a boycott is not the right approach. The right approach, instead of saying no, is instead of saying they don't want to buy any tropical timber, they have changed their position and they realize it's actually discriminating against tropics, because maybe it's a Western timber, but it's also from a poorly managed forest. And so they decided instead to shift the question, does the timber come from a well-managed forest? And then the question comes up, who's to say what is well-managed, what's not well-managed? And so schemes developed to certify timber, says, is it from well-managed or not? And some of these schemes were international, such as the Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC scheme, which is becoming increasingly well-known. And part of my work is to work with these schemes and check to see if the forests are actually being well-managed.
Oh, that's a very cool job there. Talking about ASEAN again, one of the biggest problems that we have in terms of environment in ASEAN is the haze. I'm just wondering, what is your view on that? As in, like, ASEAN themselves, trying to find a solution for this, or they are just, this is not our problem?
Yeah, well, this is a good example of how ASEAN has potential, but has so far failed to realize that potential. There is this international or ASEAN agreement on transboundary pollution, which is basically the haze agreement. And it was signed more than 10 years ago and ratified by all ASEAN countries except Indonesia. Indonesia has recently said that they are almost ready to sign it, but it unfortunately has yet to be signed. And in theory, once this agreement has been ratified by all the member states, it can be implemented, and so there will be steps taken so that to prevent the recurrence of haze spreading from Indonesia to Singapore and to Malaysia and vice versa. But for whatever reason, it has yet to be ratified and has yet to be implemented. And the amount of cooperation between the ASEAN nations in terms of haze is far from what we would hope.
Yeah.
There were some positive instances, say about, I think it's about 10 years ago, when Malaysia sent a team of firefighters to Sumatra to help put out fires in Indonesia.
Oh, that's interesting.
But that was, unfortunately, it seems to have been a once-off. It hasn't been institutionalized, and there's no automatic mechanism to allow it to happen when it's needed. And it certainly was needed last year, when there was terrible haze coming across and affected Malaysia, but also affected Singapore very badly.
And some parts of Indonesia as well. So moving in to Malaysia, you are part of this, I'm not sure whether it's called protest group or environmental fighters on a few areas of environmental issues, and also you were also against the government on the KL Outer Ring Road development. Can you explain more on what your work in Malaysia, especially on the KL Outer Ring Roads highway?
All right, I'll jump in right to the KL Outer Ring Road, which has an interesting acronym, CLAW. Now, this is a highway which, as the name suggests, is to stretch all the way around KL. And in fact, most of it has been completed. It includes part of the highway to the north and to the west, and also to the south. And what's only remaining is to the east, which they call the East Klang Valley Expressway, or EKVE. Now, the federal government has already approved this project and given funds under the Highway Authority. And the only thing remaining is to decide how exactly the route will take and where it will actually link from where. Now, what makes it very controversial is they plan to put it through a forest reserve. And not just any forest reserve, but it's a forest reserve which has been gazetted as a water catchment area, and is also part of the Selangor State Park.
I see. What is the name of the forest reserve, and where is it located?
Right, there is the Ampang Forest Reserve, which is right behind Ampang. In fact, it forms the critical water catchment area for the Sungai Ampang, which there's an intake point which is used for drinking water for KL. And it's also important to protect the upper stretches of the Ampang River, because when it rains heavily, when there's a storm, the Sungai Ampang can flood. In fact, there was a very bad flood about 2 years ago.
With the water issue in Malaysia, in Selangor looming large, I'm just wondering, what is the worst case scenario if the highway is being built?
Right, well, I think it's really reckless to build any kind of highway in catchment for a dam that's important water supply for a big city like KL. There's several catchment areas. I mentioned the Ampang catchment, but there's also the Gombak Forest Reserve. And the Gombak Forest Reserve is the catchment for the Klang Gates Dam, which is a much more important source of water for KL. Now, if you put a highway through the catchment of the Klang Gates Dam, it would bring a huge amount of traffic through the area, and that traffic would bring pollution just generally by the exhaust fumes, but also there's a potential for quite a catastrophic accident. If there was a chemical spill or an oil spill or some kind of explosion along the highway, then that could cause a huge amount of pollution to enter the water supply. And as you see, now we have water rationing as a result of the drought. Well, can you imagine how much worse it would be? Is in the height of the water rationing, we had a chemical spill in the catchment of the dam, and then we would have our water supply really jeopardized.
So, about your work and also a group of your friends and protester, environmental protests. What do you call yourself? Environmental fighters, protesters?
No, what I would say is that there is an increasing trend in the Klang Valley to want to preserve the forests, the few forests we have remaining. Selangor has only about 30% of the original forest remaining, and the people living in the city especially feel that the need to have these green lungs, just open space.
So what have you done so far? I mean, you and your group, do you do protests, or do you do any campaigns, or do you file a petition?
All right, well, what we did, and I say we quite loosely, there are several groups of NGOs who have been fighting to preserve the forest and to conserve the forest. The big triumph, if you like, was in 2005, when these groups managed to convince the state and federal government to protect the huge area of forest as the Selangor State Park. This was kind of the icon of the declaration in 2005 that Selangor was a developed state. And so as a developed state, Selangor could afford to set aside these forests to be for conservation and not for logging.
I see. So anything to add on about the situation in Selangor besides the KL claw?
Yeah, right. Well, I'll talk a little bit more about the claw and the position of the Selangor state government, which has been interesting because the Selangor state government, as I mentioned, created this protected area, this Taman Warisan Negeri, or the Selangor Heritage Park.
Where is it located?
Well, it includes the whole stretch of the forest along the main range behind Kuala Lumpur. So the forest behind Ampang, the forest behind Cheras, forest behind Gombak, all the way up to Fraser's Hill. So if you look outside your window, you look east from the Klang Valley, you will see those hills covered with greenery. So all of those trees are at the moment protected. Now, to accommodate for this highway, the state government agrees in principle to a highway because they want to accept the federal government's offer to help with the traffic situation in the Klang Valley. And as you might know, the Middle Ring Road MRR2 can be rather jammed.
Yeah.
So to help with that issue, they've said, okay, the highway authority says we build another road, okay, so, and they're going to provide the funds, so the state government has no objection in principle to the highway. But in order to allow for the forest to be, the highway to go through the forest, the state will have to give up a portion of the forest reserve.
You have to cut off that part.
Yeah. So to allow that to happen, the state has said, all right, we will consult the public first, because they actually amended the Forest Act to say before any forest reserve is allowed to be given up or excised out, they will have to hold a public inquiry. So about a month ago, the state published a notice in the newspaper asking for any objections. And then they said, you can write in, and then we will listen to your objections. And fortunately, we had more than 8,000 people who have responded, and hundreds of letters have been submitted. So now we will wait and see what the response of the state is.
So now it's just wait and see. But with more awareness, I think more people will realize that protecting our forests is our main responsibility, especially if we want to live a more sustainable life. So this is the end of our Blast from the Grassroots segment. Thank you very much for coming here, Teck. I remember your name.
Thank you, Arlene. I remember your name.
Yeah. So we will move forward to another segment in a few minutes later. Thank you very much. You are listening to Durian ASEAN.